and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Television. It's our privilege to be back in person again, finally, after all these months, and we're indebted to the Huntington Convention and Visitors Bureau for letting us be on their patio today. This is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in the tri-state area, and I'm Carter Seaton, your host. And today it is my pleasure, and I do not think I have to introduce him, but I'm going to anyway. Our guest, his name is Eliot Parker, and he was, before I came along, the host of Chapters until he took a teaching position at Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. He's also since then earned his PhD, and we're just delighted now to welcome Dr. Eliot Parker to our show. Eliot is the author of 4 novels, most recently A Knife's Edge, which was an honorable mention in thriller writing at the London Book Festival. He is a recipient of the West Virginia Literary Merit Award, and his novel Fragile Brilliance was a finalist for the Southern Book Prize in thriller writing. He recently received the Thriller Writing Award by the National Association of Book Editors for all of his novels. He's also the host of the podcast program Now Appalachia, which profiles authors and publishers living and writing in the Appalachian region and is heard on the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. Right now, that show is the most listened to podcast program on their network, and I think that's remarkable. He's a graduate of the Bluegrass Writers Studio at Eastern Kentucky University with his MFA in creative writing and from Murray State University with his doctorate in English, and he now teaches at the University of Mississippi. We are so glad to have you back.
Thank you, Carter. So good to be with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
It's great. The novel, or the book he's going to talk about most today, is his new collection of short stories, which is a new venture for Eliot. It's called Snapshots. First of all, I just love that title. It's perfect because each one of your stories gives us a little snippet of a character and introduces a new character every single time. And it's a little like looking through the family photo album and having somebody say, now that's Uncle Weird, Weird Uncle Al here, and he did this and he did that. Tell us how you came up with this idea. I think some of these people, you might see a relative in them, but it might not be a relative you want to claim, because some of them are pretty strange. How did you come up with that idea of writing a snapshot of each of these characters?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carter, and so good to be with you for the program today. This is really interesting. I've been working on this short story collection since about 2011, and one of the things that this collection of stories taught me in terms of being a writer and being an author is how important character is. And that no matter what plot you have, what set of circumstances you have, what the sort of climax is going to be or the plot points involved in the story, you have to have strong characters to carry the story forward. And I think that when I was thinking about creating these characters, I wanted to put these characters in situations that were complicated, in situations that had no right or wrong answer, in situations that involved their complications and also how those complications affect relationships that they're experiencing both in their personal and professional lives. And so that's really where that idea came from, is looking at these characters and sort of just a snapshot, as you were talking about, a snapshot of their life. We're looking at just one small sliver of their existence in that story, meaning it's a moment in their day, it's a moment in their life, it's a moment where they go in with a certain set of expectations that something is going to happen. Sometimes it happens the way they expect it to, sometimes it does not. And how do they respond and how do they interact with that? And if they're dealing with other characters in their story, husbands and wives and spouses and co-workers and whoever it might be, how do those people respond and how do they get pulled into what's going on in the story? And so that's really where that idea came from. You're not looking at the entire picture of someone's life, but I feel like also in that snapshot you get a pretty good idea of the character, who that character is, their values, what they believe, what they feel, and how they respond to adversity. And so that was really the approach I was taking with getting those stories put together.
Some of these stories have almost surreal circumstances or endings or a tremendous plot twist at the end. Was that your intention with pulling that whole collection together? Because there's some that are not like that. Did you just intersperse sort of the more normal ones, shall we say, with the others. How did you make that decision?
One of the things I wanted to do is, with short stories, I love that first of all, as a reader, I love that moment where an author is taking you through a story, either a short story, a play, a novel, and you feel like you're going down this certain path, and all of a sudden something changes and the whole story gets sort of turned upside down. So I love that as a reader, and I like that approach as a writer. And some of that comes from my mystery writing and thriller writing background, where you have to have those twists and those sudden changes that kind of turn everything upside down to keep a reader engaged and interested. And so I carried some of that over into the short story collection as well, because I think that it keeps them engaged, but it also can sometimes let them see that character they've been following in a different way. If they respond to that change or that sudden twist in a certain way, you say, well, wait a minute, that's not how I expected them to respond. Or if they respond in a different way, you think, that's exactly how I would expect that character to respond. So it really, in a way, I think serves as a way to kind of peel another layer back on a character. And then, as you know, in a short story, you only have sometimes 4,000 to 7,500 words on average to tell that story. And so I think in short stories, maybe more so than in thriller novels, that twist has to be sharp, it has to be sudden, and you have to really throw the reader, I don't want to say a curveball, but really turn that story upside down so that you can reveal another layer of that character. In a novel, you'd have 40 pages to kind of lay it out, but you've got to make the twist a little sharp. So I wanted to intersperse some of that with more of the stories that are a narrative or a reflection of a certain set of circumstances to kind of give some balance to the story collection.
You talked about how you made the transition, or you decided to use short stories instead of the full novels, and you mentioned that you'd written 4 novels before this and some thrillers, and just so when you were the host here, people didn't really get to know about you and your background. So let's talk a little bit about the novels that you've written and how you came to writing.
Sure, absolutely. I came to writing, I've been writing off and on my entire life. The first time I can ever really remember being recognized for my writing was in 8th grade. My English teacher, Mr. Cyrus, encouraged me to enter a school competition, and I ended up getting the 8th grade writing award when I was in junior high. So, but he was really fantastic. His name was Tom Cyrus, and he's deceased now, unfortunately. But I can just remember him seeing something in me and encouraging me to write. He would, slip me little passages from famous writers, and he would say things to me, or what are you working on, or what are you writing on, or what are you thinking about writing about. And of course I was writing all kinds of different things at that age, but it was his encouragement that really kind of kept me on that path. And then when I was a student at Marshall, I joined a creative writing club that a friend of mine, Zach, had started, and one of the goals we had in that creative writing club was to submit something by the end of the year for publication. And of course, this was back before Submittable, when you had to use self-addressed stamped envelopes and all of that, and research it the old-fashioned way. And so I'd sent a story I had written. It was a ghost story, and I sent it to a literary journal called Spec, which was at that time run by Mary Washington College in Virginia, and they published it. And that was the first time I ever had somebody publish something creative that I had done. And from that point forward, I thought, well, maybe somebody does actually want to read something that I've written. So that's really got it all started. And I had been working on short stories. That was 2001, 2002. And so I've been working on some short stories since then, and had a few published. And then that led all of that writing led up to my first novel, which was Breakdown at Clear River, which was published in 2012. And that was my first foray into novel writing. I had no idea if I could write a novel. Would I like writing a novel? I had read all the books and heard all the advice from people that had written novels that said, when you get into this, you're either all in or you're not going to like it. And I ended up loving it. And so, that was my first story. But I'd always been, even when I was writing short stories in that period from 2002 up to 2012, a lot of my stories had that twist and that hook we were talking about earlier, and I'd gotten really interested in the thriller genre of writing, and mysteries and thrillers. And so I started reading everything I could on mysteries and thrillers, all the different writers, and looking at technique and craft and how do you put that together. And that led to 2 of my other novels, which is a series, Fragile Brilliance and A Knife's Edge, which feature a Charleston detective named Ronan McCullough, who yes, and he's got a lot of issues himself and a lot that he's dealing with. And then I took on a new challenge a couple of years ago. I wrote a novel called A Code for Murder, or Called Code for Murder, which is set in Cleveland, Ohio, and it has a female homicide detective named Stacy Tavitt. So I stepped outside of my comfort zone a little bit and wrote from a female character's perspective. I had female characters in my other stories, but this was the first time. Right, this time in Code for Murder, a protagonist was the character in the story, and so that was really great, sort of flexing my writing muscles. And so it really all got started, back in junior high. But it was that one story that literary journal at Mary Washington College published that really got me thinking people actually might want to read something I've written.
Well, obviously they do, because those 4 novels have done really well.
Yes,
yeah,
I'm
that's
very,
great.
very
Well,
appreciative.
it's not just the 4 novels; those are the series. But you've also got Breakdown at Clear River, and you wrote another one called
Making Arrangements.
Making Arrangements, right. So that one reminds me, makes me think about the first story in your collection here.
Mm-hmm.
It does talk about it's guys in a mortuary,
mm-hmm.
which you don't quite get right at the very beginning, but soon you learn that. Your family was in the funeral business,
mm-hmm.
so I noticed that a couple of these stories have to do with either a mortuary or the process of dealing with death and so forth, and you've drawn apparently from that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up, as you mentioned, my dad was a mortician, my grandfather was a mortician, so that profession in funeral service has been a part of my life, all my life. And it's a unique profession, it's a different profession, but it's such an important profession. And it's the type of profession that you don't think about much until something happens to a friend or a loved one and you realize you've got to get involved with, a mortician and a funeral director and a funeral home and going through that whole process. And I can remember watching my dad and my grandfather both love that profession, and that profession is truly a calling. And the people that they met and the compassion that they showed other people in difficult times, and for some people the most difficult time of their life, is something that I watched from afar and really took note of. And it's sort of interesting too, because I can remember talking to my dad and listening to my grandfather talk about people that they encountered in those sets of circumstances when they've lost a loved one or someone close to them has passed away. And how they learned so much about people, and how they learned so much about families, and how they learned so much about the dynamics that connect and don't connect individuals. And I tried to kind of emphasize that in the story Hands in the collection. There's another story in Snapshots called Reflections, which is a little bit different turn on that profession. But I just loved watching my dad and hearing my dad and my grandfather talk about how that profession and that business is so much about people and relationships. And it's so interesting to hear those stories and to look back at that and reflect upon that and tie that into a couple of the stories in the collection, because so much of our lives as people, but as writers and as individuals, is connected to relationships, who we come across every day. And we see people, the more you know people, and the more you work with people or live with people, the more you see them at their best and their worst. And so I can remember my dad and my grandfather talking about that as well. And so it was just something that I wanted to touch on, in my writing, and I touch on it even in the thriller stories as well. There is an element of family in all the stories, sort of in the backdrop of the crime and the murder that's taking place, because so much of life is about relationships.
Sure, and I think that comes across in your short stories in particular, because it's apparent that the psychology of how you deal with that is something you learned, and you've put it into your stories.
Yes, absolutely. And I can remember just talking to my dad and watching my dad, and he would never say this, but I can remember as I got older watching him thinking, my goodness, what a wonderful education in people his line of work is. And my dad had a wonderful memory. He had a memory that I wish I had. I mean, he could remember people, names, faces, who was married to whom, whose kids were related to whom, where they went to high school, what their favorite food was. And he could not see them for 10 years, and they'd walk through the door and he'd remember. He'd say, well, how's Mary? Is she still at WVU? Did she graduate? And I couldn't do that. I wish I could. I don't have that memory, but all of that was the connection that you have with people, and you learn those things about people, their values, their beliefs, through that process. And I think that's so important when you're creating fictional characters as well, kind of imbuing them with some of these characteristics that can make them relatable, that somebody can look at and say, I know someone like this, someone in my family, Uncle so-and-so, or it reminds me of my next door neighbor from when I grew up, or a teacher I had in high school or whatever. Because I feel like if readers can identify with a fictional character in some way and make that connection and see that that's a real person and a person that maybe they remember or can connect to from some other experience in life, they're going to be much more vested and interested in that story.
Right.
So,
right. Did you ever have the opportunity to watch your parents, your father and your grandfather, work on the deceased?
I did not. I can remember.
Or did they just tell you what the process was like?
They just kind of told me,
because you've got it, I mean, it's pretty clear that you know what they're doing.
Oh, absolutely. And there are laws about who can be, in the prep rooms and at what times. Now, when I was a little kid, we grew up till I was probably 6 or 7 years old. We lived in an apartment above the funeral home where my dad worked, and so. Much to his chagrin, I'm sure, I used to run up through the hallways when I was 3 and 4 years old, and so I'd say, "Where's Dad? Where's Dad?" Oh, he's back in the prep room. Well, I didn't know what that meant, so I just barged right on in, and probably shouldn't have done that looking back on it. But I hearing them talk about it and kind of the process, it's not something I voluntarily wanted to see, but knowing, kind of hearing them talk about it and the process, I learned just through that and through reading. Through reading and my dad and grandfather both went to mortuary school, and so they had old textbooks and old manuals from when they were in school, so I was able to kind of look through those a little bit. Right. Yeah. So the research was more research than actually being there to see it. Yeah.
Right. All right. So you've talked about all these characters and these stories that have a twisted ending. Were there writers that wrote in that frame that you are influenced by?
Oh, absolutely. I think that. One of my favorite writers, thriller writers, is an African American writer, Walter Mosley, and he does a great. He's got several series going, running series going, but my favorite series of his is with an L.A. detective, African American L.A. detective, set in the late 1950s, early 60s, named Easy Rawlins. Yes. And some of our audience may be familiar with him if you've read Walter Mosley, but. In Mosley's stories, it's never exactly as it seems. You're following Easy Rawlins through this investigation. He's a private eye, so he kind of operates outside of the police department, but also has enough police knowledge to know how things work. And you get to usually about page 120 or 30, and boom, something changes, and the whole situation just blows up for Easy, right. and the story takes another direction. So he's one of my favorites, and he's so good at that, but it's very subtle how he does it. Right. Another writer I really like is C.J. Box.
Yes, you talked about him. I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, and he does a great series of stories on a Montana game warden named Joe Pickett, who is responsible for 300 or 400 acres of this federal land. And he's the only law enforcement officer out there. And so, people come to the woods and do all kinds of things. Hang people from trees, set the woods on fire, and it's up to him to kind of solve that. But Box is a lot like Mosley in that there's a subtle twist. There's always one little, and it's often not a big blow up or explosion or a gunfight. It's one thing a character says, or it's one thing Joe and Easy observe, or it's one thing that someone says that they realize, oh, wait a minute, you told me 2 days ago something different. And all of a sudden when they start exploring that turns everything around. And so I like that. It's a subtle twist. It's not, an explosion or a firefight or something that, has to take 45 pages to get through. It's oftentimes just one little paragraph. And many times I miss it, even though I've read their work for years, and I have to go back and read it again and think, oh, well, there was the twist. I missed it. So I love that about those two are the best, I think, contemporary
when you read those things, do you dissect them or do you just read them for pleasure and then go back and kind of dissect it to learn from them?
I usually read one time for pleasure, and then I go back and kind of do a deconstruction of it and look and see how did they introduce this character? How did they manage a minor character who maybe had an important role but wasn't in the scene very long, but you keep coming back to what that character did or said. How do they manage that? How do they negotiate family and work family stories into their novels? So I usually give it two reads through to figure out kind of what's going on.
There's one story in here that's really very different from a lot of the others, and it's one of my favorites, really. It's called The Trip, and it's kind of like a good advice story. Tell us how you came to write that one.
Oh, well, that's really interesting. I had read a story in a magazine. This has been 2 or 3 years ago. I'd read a story in a magazine about travel and about it was some story. It might have been in, I don't know if it's National Geographic, one of those travel magazines you see at the bookstore. And it was talking about who's traveling and who, as the economy sort of came out of the 2008 recession, people were traveling more. It was who was traveling and what were they traveling and why were they traveling. And I read this article, and they were interviewing different, very, very rich, very wealthy couples about where were they going and why were they going. And I came upon, it was a very positive article, but there was this one little discussion at the bottom that this man and woman had about not going anywhere, and the husband didn't want to go, and the wife is kind of like a crossfire Q&A, pro and con. The wife really wanted to go, and the husband said, well, no, I don't really want to go. I don't feel like this is the time. We lost a lot of money in the collapse and the economy in 2008. We need to be saving, and I've got work to do and all this. And her response was something to the effect of, well, the work's still going to be there when we come back. Let's enjoy it while we can and travel while we're healthy and that kind of thing. So that got me thinking, what would happen if that played out in a story where you have someone who really wants to go and someone who really doesn't want to go, and they have this moment where they realize, because they're going to visit a friend in a difficult circumstance, what happens when they realize, what, maybe we do need to take that trip. And the one who was so, and in this case it's Mark, the husband in the story of the trip, who was very adamant about not going and not wanting to go, and his wife's very much, let's go. So I got it from that travel magazine, but I got to thinking, how would that play out in a story? That little snippet of conversation from them back and forth. What would that look like in a story if you throw in an external influence? So that story was a lot of fun to write, and I've really enjoyed that back and forth. And Mark's very much a smart aleck, and very much kind of he's funnier than he thinks he is, and his wife's kind of embarrassed by what he says half the time. But he eventually comes around, and they come to a mutual understanding. I'll say that about what they're going to do. So yeah.
Right. And the other story that I liked particularly was the last story. Talk about that one a little bit.
I love that story. I have to say I've gotten more comments and feedback from readers on that story than any others. And it's called Old Lady. And it's a story about a woman named Rachel who has suffered a tragedy in her life. Her husband has died. As a part of his death, or in kind of conjunction with his death, he gave her a blue amulet necklace that she wears, and she just cannot seem to take that necklace off. And so she's pursuing a relationship with a really great guy named Mason. But every time her and Mason get to a point in their relationship, physically and emotionally, where Mason feels like, and she feels like, they're getting ready to turn a corner, something happens and she pulls back. She pulls back physically, she pulls back emotionally. And that's a story of what's going on in her life, why does she feel that way, and a chance encounter that she has with a little girl in a grocery store when Rachel's really just about to fall apart because she's had an argument with Mason. It looks like Mason's walking away for good. She goes to the store because she needs something, coffee I think it was, and she kind of has a situation where she just accidentally falls in the aisle there, and this little girl comes running up to her, and it's a plucky little girl, and she points at her and says, "Old lady, old lady," and that's where the title comes from. But it's about, what does Rachel learn from the innocence of that child, and what does that child teach her about love, about life, about acceptance, and about moving on from difficult circumstances. And that, I loved Rachel's character. She's one character I would love to explore more because she's so wonderful but so broken, and I wish I had more time to spend with her in that story, or maybe revisit her some other time.
She may be in another story sometime.
She might be, but I would say I've gotten more feedback on that story out of the collection than any other. That story really seems to resonate with readers.
It's interesting to me always how somebody puts a collection together. You said you've been writing some of these stories for, 9 years or something like that. Are there some that you have written that you didn't include, that you thought just didn't quite fit?
Yes, I had originally intended this collection to be 15 stories long. There's only 11 in the collection, but I had about 4 stories that just did not fit. That thematically they didn't fit. Some of them started out as short stories, but I've kind of shelved because I thought maybe I could make a novel out of them later. Some of them just didn't connect with the theme of Snapshots, and it wasn't really as character-driven as I wanted with the other stories. And so there were 3 or 4 when I started soliciting this to publishers, and when my agent started shopping this around, that they said, well, these are really great, but these 2 or 3 don't seem to fit, or these 3 or 4 don't seem to fit. Then I was getting that consistent response. So that's when I kind of felt like, well, I'm going to take those out. If I'm getting this from 3 or 4 different publishers and editors, then I know something's right here. So those may end up in another collection someday. Those might end up as novels in different ways. So I kind of just put those off to the side and may come back to those sometime later.
All right, well, speaking of in the future,
yes,
what's next?
Well, I've just finished the first draft of the next book in the Stacy Tabbett series. It's called A Final Call. It picks up just a few months after the ending of what happens in Code for Murder. There's a cliffhanger at the end of Code for Murder. There's an accident, and Stacy's brother Chance goes missing. So we have to solve that mystery, but also in that book, one of Stacy's former college classmates, comes to her and says, "My son is missing, and I want you to find him." So Stacy goes looking for him and then finds out he's connected to a murder. And so that whole story is unfolding, and was he really involved? Was he framed? Was he set up? And then what's happened to Chance? Where is he? And will he be reunited? Will Stacy be able to find him? So I'm working on that. I'm also working on another collection of short stories. I don't have any of the 4 we were talking about included in the new collection, but I've got 2 that I've already finished, and I've sent out to some literary journals just to get some feedback, and hopefully those can get published in the next coming year, in 2020 or 2021. Yeah. So I've got a lot of irons in the fire, but
no new stories on Ronan yet.
Not yet. I've got his next journey outlined, and I've got it kind of structured to where I want it. I just haven't sat down and started writing it. But yeah, Ronan has got a lot more adventures coming his way, and a lot more stress and strain coming his way. So, and I love that character too. So much fun spending time with him. And
I suspect you've had more chance this summer to write than you did, than you do when you're having to teach.
Yes, that makes a big difference. And my schedule at Ole Miss is different in that, I'm not doing as much in the classroom teaching as I used to. And I love working with students, and I enjoy that very much. But that's given me more time during the week to write. It used to be I would get up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock and write early in the morning before everybody got up. Well, now I have a different schedule to where I can come home and maybe my day's ended at 2 in the afternoon, and I can write for a couple of hours and not have to get up so early and write when my brain's still semi-fresh.
Yeah,
so that's allowed me to get through a lot of projects a lot faster than I used to.
That's great. That's great. Elliot, it's been so wonderful to have you with us. This is really a nice kind of turnabout's fair play, because you've interviewed me a couple of times on this show, so it was great to be able to turn the tables. Thanks so much for coming down and giving us a chance to talk to you again today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I thank again the Convention and Visitors Bureau for letting us use their space, and remind you that the Red Caboose will be carrying Snapshots and some of Elliot's other books when they reopen on Wednesday, and they also carry books by other people who have been on chapters. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Carter Seaton, and we'll see you again another day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.